Hi, Karl de Leeuw here. Welcome to Light Surface. Today we've got a very distinguished guest, Mark Mirabello. Just to give you a little bit of intro, Mark is a professor of history at Shawnee State University. How do you pronounce that?
Shawnee State University.
That's right. I see that's in Portsmouth, Ohio. So for those from across the world, they're not sure exactly, that is west of Washington, DC, the capital. And you're a visiting professor, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it in Russia. What is the?
Well, I will butcher it too. It's Nizhny Novgorod State University.
Yes, and I see that is just east of Moscow. I assume currently you can't travel there.
Well, I've not been there since 1994. I'm a very poor traveler. I studied overseas, but I usually stay where I am and travel the world through books.
Okay. Now, I went on Amazon. I saw there was 5 books. I know on your website there's even more. Unfortunately, we can't go into that. The one that stands out to me is the Odin Brotherhood on Odinism. I did a talk on a documentary, a 10-minute one on Creator versus God. We can't go into that topic now, but obviously that's fantastic. Where I bumped into you is on the fantastic Netflix series, The Ancient Aliens. You are one of about 100 people being interviewed. And I see you obviously on TV, on radio, and so forth. So everyone listening, Mark certainly knows his stuff, and very, very privileged to have him here today. The topic today is my Jesus in India documentary. It's basically, to sum it up, it says that between age 13 and 29, Jesus was actually taught by the Hindu scholars for 6 years and the Buddhist monks for 6 years in India and Tibet, and then went back to Israel and survived the crucifixion. And there's 2 documents that record that. The one is the Quran in verse 4, chapter, I think it's 157. And the other one is a document called the Talmud of Gamaliel. So that is a separate documentary. Please check that out. So today I've got 3 questions to Mark. And then we'll start with the first one, but I'll first mention the 3 questions. The first is, discuss Jesus in myth and history. Number 2, could Jesus, as the Quran claims, not be crucified? And thirdly, is world peace possible? And I quickly just want to ask Mark about carbon dating these documents I discussed. So Mark, over to you on the first question. Discuss Jesus in myth and history.
I'm sorry if I give you a more or less roundabout answer. I'm sort of famous for doing this when I teach my classes. But first, let me say that almost all remembered history is more myth than actual history, just by definition. And by the way, myths serve an important purpose. They help us to orient ourselves in the universe, and they're everywhere. For example, in the United States, there's the myth we have the right to vote. We've never had the right to vote, but that's why, for example, convicts cannot vote in many states. That's why people have to register to vote. There's never been a right to vote. In history, we have the story in America of the Pilgrims. These are godly people seeking religious freedom. In reality, they had no minister for 9 years. One of the members on the Mayflower was later committed a murder and was hanged by the other members on the Mayflower. And for 25 years, the Pilgrims kept the decapitated head rotting in the sun of a Native American outside their settlement to intimidate the Native Americans. So we again have myths everywhere. Civil War, it's freedom versus slavery. In fact, there were 80,000 slave owners in the North throughout the entire war, 400,000 slaves throughout the entire war, 320,000 slave owners in the South, about 5 million slaves. Now, in terms of Jesus, to again tie in the story, I should mention, first of all, and again, and when I say it's a myth, I want to make it very clear. I don't want your viewers to misunderstand. I'm not saying it's fiction, don't believe it. A myth is a cherished belief. Sallust, the Roman, said, it's that which never was but always is. And if you go back to the, let's say, the Old Testament, almost certainly the entire Moses story is a myth. Strangely enough, the ancient Greeks give us the first non-Jewish account of what occurred, and it's totally different from what we teach in our Sunday schools. They claim there was a great disaster in Egypt, perhaps a plague, and then the most extreme version of the story is that the Pharaoh consulted the priests and said, "What is happening?" And that he then was told by the priest, "We have lepers among us." So all the lepers were driven out into the wilderness. And when they were driven out in the wilderness, one of their members became their leader, and they went to the Holy Land. This is the Greek version of the story. And then when they got there, Moses, their leader, taught them that we're going to reverse everything that other religions do. See, what's curious, in Judaism, you cannot make religious art or pictures. Egyptian writing is essentially beautiful pictures. It's been called the most beautiful form of writing ever. They have multiple gods. Judaism has the one God. The Egyptians were obsessed with afterlife. The Torah, the original, really holy part of the Jewish canon, there's no discussion of afterlife whatsoever. And many Jews, even today, think there is no afterlife, although they've been influenced by Islam and Christianity, and some modern Jews, using the Kabbalah, for example, say there is an afterlife. And then finally, Egyptians were obsessed with preserving the bodies of the dead, mummification. It seemed to be what's called sympathetic magic. Things remain connected, or I should say contagious magic. Things remain connected, and they thought as the body decomposed, the soul weakened. And then by preserving the body, the soul is preserved. To this day, Jewish people may not embalm the dead. They bury them in wooden boxes, no embalming, and put a bag full of earth on the belly to hasten the decomposition. And in fact, ideally, it's earth from the Holy Land is placed in a bag, although not everyone does that, on the stomach to speed it up. And in fact, they call that the judgment of the grave. There's a tradition in Judaism that the dead person feels the decomposition. So that's why they want to speed it up. So, and it's also interesting, we go back to the leprosy concept. It's interesting, both Moses and his sister Miriam have leprosy. It's referred to in the Bible. Moses' case, he can do it on command as a miracle. Now, he's also obsessed with leprosy in his 613 laws of Moses. We always talk about 10 commandments. There's actually 613 laws of Moses. And by the way, we've become so secular in the West. If you tried to follow the 613 laws of Moses, they would put you in a prison or a mental hospital. That's how far we are away from our traditions now, our original traditions in the West. But at any rate, it's interesting. He practices segregation of partial lepers. If a person develops leprosy, he's examined by the high priest. The priest pronounces him unclean, and he separates from the congregation. But when he's totally covered with leprosy, he's let back in. So in other words, viewed almost as honorable to be a leper. Now, I should mention, again, this is kind of curious, 20% of the words in ancient Hebrew are of uncertain definition. It's possible we're completely mistranslating, the word leper. It's interesting that the person who gets it, his skin is as white as snow, which doesn't sound like leprosy to me. So we could be mistranslating the word. But at any rate, is the Moses story real? It's too conventional. And see what people can do. Instead of saying our ancestors were expelled because they were ill from the richest place on earth at the time. Anyone going from Egypt in antiquity to Canaan today would be like going from Beverly Hills to Guatemala. Not Guatemala to Beverly Hills to Guatemala. The richest country on the earth at the time, going to one of the most desert, dry, impoverished areas. So what you do is you turn the story around. You say, we were not expelled. We were not lepers. We were God's chosen people, and we left for freedom. And they tried to keep us there. And the Pharaoh sent his chariots after us. We can date it by the way, chariots are only from the New Kingdom era, so that's a late time in Egyptian history. And they tried to stop us, but we divided the Red Sea, and we passed through, and they were destroyed. So, and if you move now closer to later times, now this will sound shocking to your audience. Professor Thompson, who used to teach at Marquette University, United States, he was harassed and now lives in Denmark. He's originally of Danish extraction, I believe. I think he was teaching at the University of Copenhagen, although he may be retired now. He claims not only were Adam and Eve mythical, and Abraham and Sarah mythical, and Moses and Aaron and Joshua mythical. He even says that David and Solomon are mythical. And in fact, modern archaeology seems to be proving this, because it appears as if around the year 1000, in which Solomon is typically dated, Jerusalem is a squalid little hamlet. And it seems to be that and by the way, the land of Canaan was divided up into about 100 little mini states at this time. Not the great wealthy Solomon, who later meets the Queen of Sheba with his 1,000 wives and treasures. If he did exist, he was probably a sheik living in a tent or some little squalid hamlet. But over time, the story becomes embellished. And again, David, there's really no evidence. But they probably existed, and probably maybe there was a Moses, but they were little people with little stories, and it becomes exaggerated. Much like Americans, I note your accent, and of course I'm an American, we've turned Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin into these great 18th century wise sages. 18th century people at the time viewed them as basically hicks, because they were in the colonies, far away from civilization, and virtually everything they did was plagiarized from elsewhere. Second Treatise of Government becomes, again, Jefferson's notions of the Declaration and so forth, and law. But again, moving now to Jesus, finally getting there, we know there were hundreds of gospel accounts circulating in the early church. What essentially happened what has happened in modern Christianity is an orthodoxy by the 4th century emerged, and the other ones were suppressed, literally. In fact, oddly enough, beginning in the late 19th century and also in the middle of the 20th century, we've discovered some of these lost books, the Gospel of Judas, the Acts of Pontius Pilate, the Gospel of Philip, Gospel of St. Peter, and they depict a very different Jesus from the ones we're used to thinking of in the Sunday school churches. And there's a wide variety of opinion. And I'll just give you one example. Marcion, who was an early leader of Christianity, he was a Roman Gentile. He had no background in Judaism whatsoever. And his main goal was he rejected the Old Testament and claimed that Jesus was teaching a brand new, if you will, or a purified, he wasn't saying new, it was a purified religion for the human race that was open to everybody. But the Old Testament God was not God, according to Marcion. He was an entity that thought he was God. That's called Gnosticism. And incidentally, he collected letters of Paul, some of them, and wrote a gospel. Modern scholars, they always give the least embarrassing interpretation, say that he was circulating an edited version of the Gospel of Luke. What he may have written was our Gospel of Mark. Notice the similarity. Marcion, Mark, the name. Now in Christian tradition, it's John Mark, the associate of Paul, who wrote that book, but we don't know that for certain. And it could have been written by Marcion. And incidentally, the three really important Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels. John is totally different. If you have pious viewers out there, Jesus doesn't really work. He sermonizes, he lectures like a professor. Whereas in the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, you have the parables and the beautiful stories and the healings and so forth. And it's interesting that we know that Luke and Matthew were written based on Mark. Roughly 660 verses of Mark appear word for word in Matthew and Luke. They copied the work and then added material to it. In Matthew's case, he collected over 50 Messiah prophecies and then told Jesus' story to make it look as he was fulfilling the prophecies, even though some major ones were ignored. For example, Isaiah prophecy seems to say that Jesus will see his son, the Messiah one, I should say, will see his son. I think it's Isaiah 52. I can't remember specifically, but he will see his seed. Also, Isaiah says the Messiah prophecy, he will be ugly in appearance and shocking. Now, that's actually in the early Christians, that was a tradition that Jesus was disabled. In some cases, he has a hunchback or is lame, and he's ugly in appearance. But what happened over time, mainly when Greeks converted, ancient Greeks thought there was a connection between the soul and the body. And if you had an ugly body, you had an evil soul. If you had a beautiful body, you have a beautiful soul. I'm in trouble, by the way, a little joke there. And what happened is because of the Greeks, they wanted to have the handsome Jesus. And notice that part of the story clearly doesn't go with the rest. He's born in poverty. He's laid in a manger. He's born in some kind of animal shed. His parents are impoverished. When they take him to the temple for the naming and circumcision, they have to offer birds as an offering to God. That shows extreme poverty. And he grows up in the middle of nowhere. But the one exception, he has no wealth. One exception is he's good looking. That's the Greek spin. At any rate, back to the story now of Jesus. I make it very clear. There are some accounts that say he didn't blink. These are the suppressed books that we found, that he didn't blink or make footprints. Many accounts, and you referred to this in your part two, I'll mention it now. There's an ancient tradition that he was not crucified. That's not just found in Islam. That's found in Gnostic texts. There's the wisdom of the great Set. In fact, he watches somebody else being crucified and laughs because they have the wrong person. Now, Islam has a story from the Quran that they crucified his likeness or twin. There's another suppressed idea that the Christians have suppressed, because in the original, there's a Saint Thomas in the Gospel of John. That's not his name. His name is Judas. Now, that may not be the other Judas, because Judas was a common name. It's Judas the twin. Judas Thomas. Thomas means the twin. And so as not to confuse the faithful, now they've dropped the Judas part and call him St. Thomas. And by the way, the original purpose of the story, everyone knows it if they have a Christian background, where Thomas doubts the story of the resurrection. And then Jesus appears and Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus and says, "Now I believe." And then Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen, but have believed."
Is that where the doubting Thomas comes from?
Sorry?
Is that where the saying doubting Thomas comes from?
Exactly. But here's the catch. Thomas, and we have a book called The Acts of Thomas and the Secret Gospel of Thomas. Thomas is Jesus's twin brother. He's not just an apostle, he's his twin brother. And in the Acts of Thomas, people keep confusing the two men. And it gets even stranger. In the Acts of Thomas, Jesus sells Thomas into slavery to teach him humility. Now, today, slavery has become the third rail. You don't talk about it. It's the ultimate evil, although it's mentioned 1,000 times in the Bible. But we now camouflage it. We translate it servant rather than slave. The good and faithful servant is actually good and faithful slave. Epistle of Philemon, that's Paul writing and telling a runaway slave to go back to his master. Epistle of Peter, he tells the slave to take your beatings quietly, you'll get a reward in heaven. But we've airbrushed all this out. Now, and incidentally, in the famous depiction of the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, before that painting, they always used to depict the moment when Jesus said, "This is my body," or "This is my blood." Da Vinci, he always liked to do things in an unusual way. He depicted the moment where Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." If you look at the painting, everybody seems to be moving, except for two men, Jesus in the center and Judas. But here, the reason I brought this up, Da Vinci puts the face of Jesus on St. Thomas. But to avoid being harassed by the church, we see Thomas at the end of the table in profile, not head on. So people don't notice it's the same face. It also gets even murkier rather quickly. Now remember, every famous and great person generates hatred. No matter how holy you are, you will generate opposition and hatred. I wish people would remember that, because today we think when someone is hated, they really should be hated. That's not the case. And Jesus quickly generated hate literature. And there were all kinds of hostile accounts. And one of them was that they faked the resurrection, the apostles did. They stole the body, and then Jesus was crucified, and then Thomas appeared in his place as Jesus. So to prevent that accusation, the last gospel by far is John. He's written last. He puts both men in the same room at the same time after the crucifixion. And speaking of which, we don't know that Jesus was crucified on a cross. That'll shock your audience. There are several references, like in Acts of the Apostles and the letter of Peter, he's hanged on a tree. And in fact, in early Jewish accounts, remember, Jews were hostile to him for obvious reasons. They rejected him as the Messiah. They claim, by the way, there are early accounts within the Jewish community that Mary was a loose woman. Of that account, see, what happened was they turned it around. To address it, they turned him into a virgin, her into a virgin. Paul is the oldest part of the New Testament. We know that because he never cites our Gospels. He's completely unaware of our Gospels. They're written later. He never mentions the virgin birth. Neither does Mark. It's the later two books, Luke and Matthew. His mother was a loose woman, according to the Jewish community. She's raped or seduced by a Roman soldier named Pantera. That's why the rock band took the name. They were doing this on purpose. And she then passes off the pregnancy as miraculous when she marries Joseph and pretends it's miraculous. It's interesting, the hostile Jewish accounts do not deny his ability to work miracles. They say he stole the name of God, tattooed it on his arm, and used that to work miracles. See, pious Jews may not tattoo themselves. I don't know what some modern Jews are doing, but they're not supposed to do that. That's prohibited in the laws of Moses, marking the body like that. The only marking of the body is the circumcision. And that's copied from Egypt because only priests were circumcised in Egypt. So Moses is saying, we are all now special. All of our men are special. And it's so important that even pious Jews will circumcise dead babies because they must be recognized when they go to the next world. So the dead baby is circumcised. So we have this story of, well, first of all, it wanders. There are some Gnostics that said that actually Jesus was like a supernatural being. Others had, this was the one I thought always made the most sense. It's called adoptionism, that Jesus was an ordinary man. And then when he went to the River Jordan to be baptized by his cousin, John the Baptist, that's when God fills him. The Christ fills him at that moment. And then that's why there's the dove in the sky and the voice, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." Then he goes on his mission of teaching. Then he's later killed. And when he's on the cross, we'll go back to the cross story, the Christ leaves him because the Christ cannot be killed. And that's why Jesus utters the really peculiar words from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? The adoptionist said, by the way, he speaks 7 times from the cross. That can't be a coincidence. The adoptionist heresy said, that's when the Christ left him. And for the record, most Americans are unaware of this. There are people who believe that Christ was here in the 18th century. The Shakers, who followed Mother Ann Lee, believe that the first Christ came and filled the man Jesus, and then in the 18th century, he filled the Englishwoman Mother Ann Lee, who moved to America, and that she was the Christ, or filled by the Christ. So we have these stories. So who was he? And by the way, we don't actually know when he lived. We're now going back to history, because the Bible indicates Herod tries to kill the children, the infants. Herod dies in 4 BC. So our dates are clearly wrong, that date. Also, Irenaeus, who was an early writer, talks about Jesus living to an old age and was still alive in the time of the Emperor Trajan, which is in the 2nd century, which brings us to the story in Islam that he was not crucified and moved east with his mother. And of course, today you can go to Srinagar in Kashmir, and they claim they have the tomb of Jesus there and that they have the tomb of Mary. Now, again, Christians would reject this. And I think they say he died at age 103. However, this gets strange. There's a town in Japan, a village, and I actually I can't remember it. I don't know if I can find it. It's Shingo, I believe is the name of the town. Christianity was outlawed in the 17th century, so it went underground. And when it reemerged in the 19th century, they taught that Jesus moved to Japan, married a Japanese woman, and then is buried there. So the true story of who this person was and what he represented, it will never really be known. Now, Islam avoided some of these problems because I think it was the 3rd caliph destroyed different versions. There were multiple versions of the Quran, and he chose one and destroyed the other 2. In Christianity, they never did that, and this leads to massive confusion. In fact, Bart Ehrman, who's, I believe, at University of North Carolina, he's down there in North Carolina somewhere, Duke or North Carolina, he has pointed out, if we collect all of our oldest or our New Testament manuscripts and count the differences in the texts, they actually have more differences than there are words in the New Testament.
True.
And incidentally, they really do spin the translations. For example, our oldest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, ends with the words, and they were afraid. They find the empty tomb, and he's gone, but they don't know what happened, and that's how it ends. And somebody apparently tacked on the last chapter, which shows the resurrected Jesus. In fact, it's really odd because the snake handlers, which we have in America, people who handle snakes as a sign of faith and can drink poison, that's in the last chapter of Mark. You can drink poison and handle serpents without danger as an act of faith. Now, modern scholars will say that we lost the ending of Mark on the oldest manuscripts, and that's where it went. But there are other major variations. The famous story, he who is without sin cast the first stone, that's now found in our oldest examples of John. It seems to be a later edition. The shortest Acts of the Apostles versus the longest, there's a 10% difference in length. So, but to sum all this up, because I know I've gone on quite long, what's important is not the actual history. What's important is what people believe. In fact, there's a concept in the East called non-dualist thought, that we are creating the universe with our thoughts. This is a collective dream, which would mean if we believe the Orthodox story, it becomes real. And if we doubt it, it becomes false, because we're creating not only the present, but the past as well. This is a really curiosity. I've always intrigued me.
Yeah. My view about that is that even if you don't want to believe, if especially Christians, because I'm a Christian myself, not a church-going Christian, but a Christian, born a Christian from Pretoria, South Africa, the heart of apartheid, very staunch church. That even if you don't believe that, but at least if you can perceive that it might not be true that Jesus didn't die on the cross, as the Quran says, because then that will help bring the 5 main religions that make up 80% of humanity together. So even if you don't believe in it, even if people can be open to think that perhaps it's not true what the current Bible is saying, that to me can bring world peace, because once the 5 main religions relax, I believe that will be the start of world peace.
Well, remember though, by definition, a lot of the conflict in religious thought, it comes from monotheism. The ancient Romans, for example, would adopt the gods of the people they conquered. In fact, we're rather certain, this will sound odd, that, well, they had a special ceremony called evocation. And they, before a war, they would ask the gods of the enemy to come to Rome, and they would build them greater temples in Rome. And when they defeated the people, they would follow this promise. They would establish the temple or the statues of the cult. It's been airbrushed out, but they certainly did that when they conquered the Jews. They would have put a statue up of Jehovah, who they called Io, I-A-O. And polytheists, we talked earlier, I wrote a book on the Yodan Brotherhood, traditionally respect everybody's gods. But once you get into monotheistic ideas, it's that if my God is real, yours is false. Now, the 3 great monotheist religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, modern people are trying to say these are all the same God. We just have different names. But I guarantee you that was not thought in earlier times. We're just losing the zeal. Normally, toleration is a function of you're not above intolerance, you're below it. 18th century is when toleration really spreads because nobody cared anymore. Only one of the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution went to church, one of them. By the way, they owned 1,400 slaves collectively, and only one went to church. And that's why the word God never appears in the American Constitution, except for the year of our Lord, because they weren't interested in God whatsoever. So to me, you could argue that, although I know the third part of this show will be, is world peace possible? Could I even mention something now about that, getting out of order?
Yes, I think the second question you've already answered as well. The second question was, could Jesus, as the Quran claims, be crucified? So you've really answered that. So yes, the third question is world peace possible?
Short answer, no. I'll explain. I know you're an advocate. I've looked you up, done some research on you. And again, I commend you for this, advocate of world peace and ending war and so forth. Let me give almost a parable, but real history. When the people like Captain Cook visited Polynesia and the French visited Polynesia in the 18th century, one of the reasons religion came under attack in the 18th century by educated classes, it appeared as if the Bible had lied. And this will come into world peace in a moment. Because the Bible says very strictly, clearly in Genesis, that Adam now has to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. And they went to, for example, Hawaii and Tahiti. And first of all, the climate, it was Eden. It was always 75 degrees. There was never snow. There was so much food. People could, well, in fact, the oddest one was breadfruit. It grew on trees. And the people picked it, tossed it into a fire, and it tasted like bread, specifically the crust of bread, crust of white bread. And these Frenchmen and Englishmen were shocked because these Hawaiians didn't have to produce bread by the sweat of their brow. They picked it off trees. There was no real theft there. because everybody had what they needed. The houses, the climate was is so benign that they didn't have walls. They built a roof just to keep out the rain and slept in there. And if somebody slept in your house, nobody cared because you could sleep on the beach. That's how pleasant it was. Fish everywhere, surfing to play, no concept of sexual guilt or sin. This has been airbrushed out. Everybody was having sex with everybody else, including even children. They were just pansexuals everywhere. And these Frenchmen and Englishmen would see these naked women, beautiful naked women, greet them on the beach and offer sexual intercourse. What's interesting is the Europeans quickly corrupted the people. There were no STDs at all, and they brought them. Also, the women quickly learned prostitution. See, their men, they just openly copulated, no big deal. But these Frenchmen and Englishmen, they were always after the sex and started trading things. There were no metals on Hawaii at all. And the French and English had nails and hammers and pots. So they invented prostitution. It's just, they worked it out. Now here's where it comes into the story. So they found Eden. It appeared as if Genesis had lied. But what did the people do there in Eden? They were cannibals. Now, again, this is airbrushed out. In fact, even a few years ago, Ahrens, I think was his name, an anthropologist, tried to claim there's no evidence of cannibalism outside of starvation in the world. That's totally false. The Polynesians were cannibals. These were beautiful people living with abundance, food everywhere, beautiful climate. They killed and ate people. And Captain Cook himself was actually not only worshipped as a god afterward, but eaten. And it just shows, I think, humans, we are our own natural predators. That even if we remove the causes of war, we'll still have war. Now, again, I know you would disagree with this, and I'm a historian, so we tend to be really cynical. We have too much Machiavelli in our blood. I'd like to hope that the day will come when there will be no war and there'll be no poverty and there won't be slums and so forth. Billion people live in slums on Earth. But I have a feeling it'll never happen. In recorded history, I think we have about 200 years. The last 3,000 years is 200 years of peace. And I think it will continue.
Thank you for that. So just to wrap up, the life of Saint Isa that is purportedly in the Buddhist monastery in Lhasa in Tibet, I assume in Pali, that is the original scroll. I'm calling on the Dalai Lama. I've now got close to a person that knows him, but he's 87, the Dalai Lama now, to ask them to release that document. But okay, he's in India and not in Tibet at the moment. Now that document, if that is carbon dated, and it's the true original one, because a copy was made and that was taken to Hemus Monastery outside there. If that document is released to the world, similar to the Talmud of Chimaniel, that shows that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that was in Aramaic. If the true originals are released to the world, and I'm calling on Billy Meyer to release that, of figo.org, will that not prove that Jesus was taught by the Buddhist and that Jesus didn't die on the cross?
Well, I should mention, again, getting into mythic history, the medieval Christians heard the story of a prince who grew up in a palace and then renounced wealth and went out to teach people, including the poor. He found wisdom under a fig tree, and they thought it was a saint. They called Saint Jehoshaphat. What happened was they heard the Buddha story and turned him into a Christian saint. Now, getting into India, it's very possible in antiquity. See, the Romans even had trade factories in India. The idea that India was cut off and China was cut off from the West, that's what the rise of Islam, Middle Ages, and the decline of the economies and the ships and the trading. But the Romans had Buddhist missionaries in the Roman Empire. They were active. In fact, we're rather certain the Christians learned about monks by copying the Buddhist monks. Now, to your point, we really, first of all, I find these scientific methods of dating highly questionable. And what would happen is, I can guarantee you, skeptics are skeptics. They could carbon 14 anything, and if it went against their materialistic point of view, they would still not believe it. So let's say we found a manuscript that really was 2,000 years old, and it read that, they would come up with some explanation why they would reject it. It's just the nature of pathological disbelief. Although, frankly, even if it did not date to 2000, that really doesn't mean anything, because we don't have any original Christian manuscripts either. What we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. In the case of the Vedas of India, they weren't really written down until the 18th century after Christ. They were kept in the memory. And people would memorize them and recite them word for word exact. So what I'm trying to say is, we could have a book describing Jesus in the East that's actually a copy from 1,000 years ago, because the earlier copies have long since decomposed. Now, the irony is, we actually have the original manuscripts, such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, written by Egyptian priests because of the desert conditions and the fact they were sealed in tombs. We have, I think, British Museum has, I believe, 178 copies, something like that. And they're so well preserved, forensics was able to lift a set of fingerprints of the scribe that copied it. So we have the Epic of Gilgamesh from over 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, which is really a religious text, not a literary text. We have, in its original form, on cuneiform tablets written in clay. We have Egyptian papyri, original form. But we don't have really early Christian texts, and I would be surprised we would have them also, because the climate, now Tibet, of course, is different from India, but it's very possible there's an Eastern influence. In fact, 19th century scholars, when they first started to study Buddhism in the West, were stunned because of the similarities, and especially ethical teachings. Now, there's a tendency in the West to believe there's only one ethical system. That's what Socrates basically argued, that's moral absolutism, but in fact, that's not true. Ethics vary from culture to culture. I always tell my students, I can find a culture where there's a Lucasville maximum security prison some miles from here, that those men would fit as leaders of a society among hunters and gatherers. Strong men who can kill, defend the band, kill the enemies. Here, they're deviants. And we like pencil-necked software engineers who wouldn't last more than 10 minutes in a hunting and gathering society. So ethics vary, and it's quite striking that the Buddhist ethics and Christian ethics, and by the way, I also should mention, Christian ethics are totally different from Jewish ethics. That's often missed. When the Old Testament says, love your neighbor as yourself, it means your fellow believer. Does not refer to outsiders. Ancient cultures, the Greeks did the same thing. Jews, Greeks, Vikings, Middle Ages, they have an ethical system, how to treat your fellow people in your tribe, nation, group, and how to treat outsiders. And that's in the Old Testament laws. They're not allowed to enslave a Jewish person, but they can enslave a Gentile, which is why the Christians were seizing Africans. They used that as an excuse. We're not going to enslave Christians, we will enslave these pagans down in sub-Saharan Africa. But again, we're not certain if the original Jesus teachings are even preserved intact. Was the universal faith, where, for example, the Good Samaritan story, everybody is your neighbor, was that really his original teaching, or was it altered as the religion spread among the Gentiles
Yeah.
and multi-nations? We don't know.
Mark, I thank you for your time and your knowledge and everything. And it was a privilege for me to have you on Light Surface today. Thanks a million.
Thank you for the opportunity and the honor. I really appreciate it.